The wrought iron gates of Oak Ridge Estates gleamed in the late afternoon sun as Richard Martinez's mud-spattered Ford F-150 rumbled toward the entrance. At 53, Richard had the weathered face of someone who'd earned his success the hard way. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel, still bearing traces of the fishing trip he just returned from. A rare weekend of solitude on Lake Chatfield that had left him looking nothing like the polished CEO who typically strode through the halls of Premier Security Solutions in tailored suits. 15 years in this community had made the drive through these gates almost automatic. Richard knew every crack in the pavement, every seasonal flower in the meticulously maintained beds flanking the entrance. What most of his neighbors didn't know, what he had deliberately kept quiet, was that 3 months ago, his company had acquired the security contract for Oak Ridge Estates after the previous provider's spectacular failure during a series of break-ins. The HOA board had practically begged for his help, but Richard had insisted on maintaining a low profile during the transition. "Judge us on our performance, not our connection to me," he told them. As he approached the security booth, Richard noticed something different. The familiar faces he'd grown accustomed to were nowhere to be seen. Instead, a new guard occupied the station, young, with a security uniform that hung slightly too large on his frame and a posture that radiated the particular brand of insecurity that often masquerades as arrogance. Richard sighed inwardly. He recognized the type all too well from his 25 years in the security business. Richard rolled down his window, the pleasant exhaustion of a weekend spent in nature still clinging to him. His baseball cap was pulled low, 3-day stubble on his face, and his favorite ancient flannel shirt bore the evidence of the 4 large trout he'd caught and cleaned. "Afternoon," Richard offered with a friendly nod. The guard, whose name-tag read Derek Whitman, didn't immediately respond. Instead, he gave Richard's vehicle a theatrical once-over, his gaze lingering on the fishing gear in the truck bed before returning to study Richard with undisguised suspicion. The guard couldn't have been older than 25, with closely cropped hair and the overeager bearing of someone who had perhaps applied to the police academy and been rejected. "ID and proof of residence," Derek finally demanded, his tone clipped and performatively authoritative. The slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth suggested he was enjoying this small exercise of power. "Sure," Richard replied evenly, reaching for his wallet. "I'm Richard Martinez, 1452 Oak Ridge Drive." He'd long ago learned that in the security business, professionalism meant remaining calm even when others weren't. Behind him, Richard could see Mrs. Abernathy in her Mercedes, clearly recognizing him and looking confused about the delay. In his rearview mirror, 2 more cars had queued up. Before Richard could extract his ID from his wallet, Derek held up a hand to stop him. "New protocols," Derek announced with exaggerated importance, standing straighter and adjusting his uniform belt. "All vehicles that don't match registered owner descriptions require secondary verification and inspection." He tapped a clipboard with what appeared to be a hastily written set of rules. "Says here all residents' vehicles are logged in our system. That truck isn't in my records as belonging to any Oak Ridge resident." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. As CEO of Premier Security Solutions, he personally reviewed and approved all protocol changes for their high-end residential contracts. These new protocols were news to him. "That's interesting," Richard replied carefully. "I've lived here 15 years, and this truck is registered with the HOA. It's my weekend vehicle." He gestured to his company's discreet logo on the clipboard Derek was holding. "I'm actually quite familiar with our security protocols." Derek's expression hardened. "Our protocols? Look, sir, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. And right now, the rules say you need secondary verification." The emphasis on "sir" made it sound more like an insult than a courtesy. From the growing line behind him, Richard heard a car horn honk briefly. Derek seemed to swell with the attention, clearly relishing having an audience for his performance. "I'll need to call the registered homeowner to verify your identity," Derek stated, reaching for the booth phone with theatrical slowness. "I am the homeowner," Richard replied, his patience remarkable even to himself. His curiosity about how far this would go was starting to be overshadowed by genuine concern about the resident experience his company was providing. "That's what they all say," Derek retorted with a snort. "Contractors, gardeners, pool guys, always trying to get in claiming they work for someone. For all I know, you could have stolen that truck." Richard noticed Elaine Chin, his neighbor and the HOA board president, pulling up in the growing line of vehicles. She was craning her neck to see what was causing the delay, her expression shifting from impatience to recognition when she spotted Richard's truck. "Look," Richard said, his voice remaining measured, "there seems to be some confusion. Why don't you call your supervisor so we can sort this out?" Derek's face flushed. "Are you telling me how to do my job? Because I can call the police instead for attempted trespassing. Your choice." The car horn sounded again, longer this time. Derek's flush deepened, but rather than addressing the growing traffic issue, he seemed to double down. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." The command was delivered with the kind of forced authority that people use when they're out of their depth, but refuse to admit it. A concerned Elaine had now parked her car and was approaching on foot. "Richard, is everything all right?" she called out. Derek whirled around. "Ma'am, please return to your vehicle. This is a security matter." Richard had seen enough. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was affecting his neighbors and, more importantly, reflecting poorly on the service his company had promised to deliver. "Derek," Richard said quietly but firmly, "I think we need to clear something up." He pulled out his wallet and extracted not just his driver's license, but also his Premier Security Solutions business card, embossed with the company logo, his name, and Chief Executive Officer in clear typography. "I'm not only a resident," he said, handing both items to the now frozen guard. "I'm also the CEO of Premier Security Solutions, your employer." The clipboard in Derek's hand dipped as his posture deflated. The color drained from his face so rapidly that for a moment Richard was concerned the young man might faint. I didn't," Derek stammered, all trace of his previous arrogance vanishing. "I'd like you to radio your supervisor immediately," Richard continued calmly. "We need to discuss these new protocols that I wasn't made aware of." Elaine had reached the gate by now, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning amusement as she pieced together what was happening. "Everything okay here, Richard?" "Just a small misunderstanding about security protocols, Elaine," Richard replied with a meaningful look. "Nothing that can't be resolved promptly." Derek fumbled with his radio, nearly dropping it twice before managing to call for his supervisor, his voice noticeably higher than before. Maria Vasquez arrived at the gate within 3 minutes, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. As operations manager for Premier's residential division, she had been personally selected by Richard for her exceptional judgment and people skills. "Mr. Martinez," she greeted him professionally, though Richard didn't miss the flash of mortification in her eyes. "I apologize for the inconvenience." By now, the line of waiting vehicles had grown to 7, with several residents watching the unfolding drama with undisguised interest. Derek stood rigidly beside Maria, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as though hoping to become invisible. "Let's clear this traffic first," Richard suggested. "We can discuss this in more appropriate surroundings." 30 minutes later, in the community clubhouse, the full story emerged. Derek Whitman had been with the company for just 3 weeks. This was his first assignment after training, and it quickly became clear he had been embellishing his authority with residents who didn't fit his preconception of who belonged in Oak Ridge Estates. "This isn't an isolated incident," Maria admitted, consulting her tablet. "We've received complaints from the Ngayans in the East Section, and the landscaping crew reported similar treatment. I was planning to address this tomorrow, but..." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable, having to discuss this with her CEO. Richard listened, his expression neutral, but his mind racing through the implications. The HOA contract was significant for Premier, but more than that, Oak Ridge was his home. The idea that his neighbors, particularly those of color or in service roles, had been subjected to such treatment was deeply troubling. "Has he been following any of our actual protocols?" Richard finally asked. Maria hesitated. His verification processes are inconsistent at best. He seems to wade through certain residents without ID checks while giving others. She glanced at Richard's casual fishing attire. Excessive scrutiny. At 8:00 a.m. the following morning, Richard walked into Premier's headquarters dressed in his usual impeccable suit, all traces of the weekend fisherman gone. He had spent much of the night reviewing security footage from the Oak Ridge Gate over the past 3 weeks and preparing for the emergency meeting he had called. The company's management team sat on one side of the conference table, with the Oak Ridge HOA board on the other. Richard had specifically invited several residents who had reported issues with security, including Mr. Nguyen, a retired doctor, and Carlos Mendez, who ran the landscaping company servicing many homes in the community. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Richard began, his tone grave but measured. "Yesterday, an incident occurred that brought to light some serious concerns about our security services at Oak Ridge Estates." Without naming Durek specifically, Richard outlined the pattern of selective enforcement and resident harassment that had emerged from his review. Using the security footage, he demonstrated the stark contrast in how different residents were treated. "This is not what Premier Security Solutions stands for," he stated firmly, "and it is certainly not what Oak Ridge Estates represents as a community." Elaine Chen, the HOA president, spoke up. "I think I speak for the entire board when I say we're disturbed by what we're seeing. We contracted with Premier specifically because of your reputation for professionalism, and we failed to uphold that reputation," Richard acknowledged without hesitation. "For that, I personally apologize. But more importantly, I want to outline the immediate steps we're taking to rectify this situation." What followed was a comprehensive plan that went far beyond addressing a single problematic employee. Richard proposed a complete overhaul of the security protocols, with an emphasis on consistent application and respectful resident interaction. He introduced a new QR code system for residents and their regular service providers, eliminating the subjective element of gate access. Most significantly, he proposed a community feedback mechanism, an anonymous system where residents could report both positive and negative experiences with security personnel. Security should make residents feel safe, not harassed. Richard concluded, "We need to rebuild that trust." The changes at Oak Ridge Estates unfolded over the following months with remarkable efficiency. Durek Whitman was reassigned to Premier's training facility, not as a punishment, but with a clear development plan that included extensive work on implicit bias and professional communication. Richard had been tempered by enough life experience to recognize the difference between malice and immaturity. "Sometimes people need to be fired," he told Maria during their weekly review, "and sometimes they need to be taught." The new QR system streamlined entry for residents and approved service providers, reducing wait times and eliminating the inconsistent application of access rules. The anonymous feedback system quickly became a valuable tool, not just for identifying problems, but for recognizing exceptional service as well. 6 months after the incident, Richard found himself once again approaching the Oak Ridge Estates gate after a fishing trip, looking just as disheveled as he had that fateful day. This time he was greeted by a security officer who scanned his QR code with a friendly nod. "Catch anything good, Mr. Martinez?" the guard asked with genuine interest. "2 bass and a story about the one that got away," Richard replied with a smile. As he drove through the gate, Richard reflected on the unexpected benefits that had emerged from that confrontation. Resident satisfaction with security had increased dramatically. The community had come together around the issue, with the HOA board hosting monthly meetings where residents could voice concerns about any aspect of community life. Perhaps most surprisingly, Durek Whitman had completed his retraining program and was now assisting with developing improved protocols for other residential communities. His experience had become a case study in Premier's training program, a reminder that security was about people, not just procedures. That evening, as Richard put away his fishing gear, he received an email from Elaine Chen. The subject line read simply, "Survey results." The community's quarterly satisfaction survey showed a 94% approval rating for security services, the highest in Oak Ridge's history. Richard smiled as he closed his laptop. Sometimes the most uncomfortable moments led to the most meaningful improvements, And sometimes, a power-tripping security guard unwittingly makes things better for everyone.